Scripture this morning is from Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33. Peter and the boat. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It must be a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Thanks be to God.
When he prayed upon the mount, were you there when he prayed upon the mount? Oh, sometimes it can cause me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when he prayed upon the mount? Were you there when he healed us from disease? Were you there when he healed us from disease? Oh, sometimes it can cause me to tremble, tremble. Were you there as he healed us from disease? Were you there when he raised them from the dead? Were you there as he raised us from the dead? Sometimes it causes me to tremble. Were you there as he raised him from the dead.
Would you join with me in prayer? May the words of our mouths, the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So by now, 8 years into this relationship we have with each other, all of you know that I'm from Western Pennsylvania. And today, the folksy story from that part of the world begins with an awareness that where I'm from, the two most observed religions are Catholicism and American football. So Catholicism and American football, two most observed religions, not necessarily in that order. I have to say, we had worship ahead of the Super Bowl a few weeks ago, right? And the San Francisco 49ers were in the Super Bowl, and some of you came decked out in your team colors. When the Steelers were in the football and in the Super Bowl, Mass was done early. The priest was in colors, and we all prayed throughout the Mass that we would be victorious. I'm not saying we're going to do that here, nor am I saying that it's theologically sound. I'm just trying to set the stage for what this experience might be like, right? And it's not just professional football that we love in Western Pennsylvania. We love high school football, and of course, if you're going to have high school football, you got to have junior high football, so they're ready to go. It's kind of a status symbol to be a football coach in Western Pennsylvania. My brother is one, and many of the other boys who I went to high school with went on to work in football in some ways, and I have a friend who coached junior high football for a number of years in Western Pennsylvania, and I remember kind of early on when he was first recruiting his first team, he said he knew right away that he had found his kicker, right? If you don't know much, raise your hand if you have no idea what football is. Okay, it's good. So there's a kicker. It's weird. For a game called football, you only kick the ball twice a game, but they had this kicker, right? It doesn't make sense. They had this kicker, and this kid, he's 11 or 12 years old, and the coach said, he was making field goal kicks 30 yards out, 35 yards out. In practice, he was just a machine, right straight through the uprights. So they recruited this young man, brought him out to his first game, right? The team scores a touchdown. Now there's the extra point. Kid goes up to kick the ball and actually just misses the ball entirely and falls over. It turns out this young man has performance anxiety. He gets really nervous in the game. He doesn't like the noise of the crowd, right? And this did not improve over the course of the season. The coach tried to do a number of things, tried to put music in his ears, tried to put blinders on him so he wouldn't see the score, right? Just get him out there, just kick the ball. No. And because I'm from a part of the world where men are men and so are women, the coach said, you can't just sit on the bench. I don't care that you go out there and you cry. You can't just sit on the bench. You need to go out there every game and try to kick that ball. And so he went out there every game for that first half of the season, and every time, courageously, absolutely missed the uprights. Week after week, this season of Lent, we will be looking at Peter, who is often found, I would say, missing the proverbial uprights, right? Today we find him on a boat, which again, he's a fisherman. This should be his comfort zone. And yet, this is not the kind of situation he seems to be able to handle. They've all been on a boat before. Surely they have been on a storm. We have assessed again that the Sea of Galilee is actually just a lake. So why are they so afraid? Why are they so afraid of this storm? This is where it helps sometimes when we're looking at stories of Jesus to really put it in the larger narrative arc. We are in the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, And just at the beginning of this chapter, they hear the news of the execution of John the Baptist. Our disciples, Jesus is from a very small part of the world. He's from a very insular Palestinian Jewish community. They certainly knew John. In some of the Gospels, Jesus is even John's cousin. They certainly would have been friends with him. I think it's helpful to remember that in the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, the disciples are all in grief. They are all in significant grief. And then after the death of John the Baptist, right before this passage, Jesus decides to throw a dinner party for 5,000 people. Nothing like facing grief with, like trying to not deal with it by doing additional work. So beyond their complaining with all of the energy that went into the feeding of the 5,000, that miracle probably set off an alarm for the disciples. Why would that be? Why would the disciples be concerned about the feeding of the 5,000? What's coming next? That's right. So literally they have just served the head of one prophet on a silver platter. If you don't know the story of John the Baptist, go back and look at that one. And now Jesus is raising his profile, right? So John has just been executed by the state, and now Jesus is raising his profile. Jesus is being seen by the empire around him. They are in grief. And it's often just a very small step to move from grief to fear. Right? That's my experience, that it's a small step to move from grief to fear. I've been reflecting on this in the last 2 weeks because I have a friend who many months ago suffered a great personal loss. She suffered a great personal loss and has been in a state of profound grief, which is normal and human and expected. And unfortunately for my friend, her grief has metastasized into fear. Right? All she sees now in the future is what will go wrong. She is afraid that she will never find someone who will love her again. And she's missing, of course, that I love her. I'm there with her often. Lots of other people in her life love her, and the future that she fears is actually now, and she's doing relatively okay, all things considered. But fear keeps her from seeing the possibility of her present reality because she is solely focused on what is bad, and if it's not bad, what could become worse, right? Dare I say it, we see this in our nation, right? There's so much fear right now in our country. I have bad news. That's going to get a lot worse before November, right? We see so much fear, right? Fear of immigrants, fear of religious minorities, and a weird twist, fear of drag queens. I'm not sure where that came from, but it makes no logical sense. It makes no logical sense because immigrants and religious minorities have been a part of this country since its founding, and drag queens have been a part of this country at least since the first saloon. I mean, at least, right? And yet, now we are afraid. We are deeply afraid as a nation. It makes no rational sense, but it makes a lot of human sense in some ways. It makes embodied sense, right? We as a people, as a nation, are afraid because we are also in grief, right? As the generation of boomers is aging, we have a large portion of our population who is grieving what it means to get older, right? We are grieving a loss of control on the world stage. We have grief around climate change. We're grieving around the fact that this consumer capitalism thing that was supposed to make all of us perpetually more successful has not really worked out for very many of us, right? We have lots of reasons to be in grief as a nation, and grief is hard. Grief is really hard. Does anyone else have a hard time with grieving? Can you raise your hand if you have a hard time with grieving? Okay, great. Well, not great for you, but great for me. Why is grief hard for you, if it's hard for you? I want to just shout out. Sorry? Grief is uncomfortable. Great. What else? Grief is immobilizing. That's right. Okay, so as far as Juan in his culture as a Hispanic man, he's supposed to hold it in, right? Not supposed to grieve. I think that's true that's different in different cultures, but a lot of biological men, right? You're not supposed to grieve, right? Don't cry. I'll give you something to cry about, right? Go ahead, Wes. Pride gets in the way of grief. Pride gets in the way of grief. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. You've grieved enough. Move on. Get over it. Yeah, it was just your cat Sprinkles, right? Like, move on. Sorry, that was a personal experience. Anyway, go ahead, Meg. You have no control over grief. Guys, grief is awful. Go ahead, Gail. Grief seems like it will never go away. It is like a bottomless pit that will swallow you up, right? It's something that freezes you in place. Grief is hard because grief makes us feel helpless sometimes, right? Grief is hard because there's no way to resolve it. You can only slug through it. And grief is hard because grief leaves us often despairing. So I think, personally at least, that grief moves to fear because it's a survival mechanism. Grief moves to fear because that is self-serving. It's a form of self-protection to move from grief to fear because fear is something you can do something about. Fear is something you can do something about. You can blame someone if you are afraid. Why despair when you could fight? Why cry when you could run away from something or freeze? Why process your feelings when you can panic? When in doubt, you can almost always find a reason to panic. As someone who finds it really difficult to not do anything, as someone who always feels like I need to act rather than wait, I try my hardest never to grieve, but I am often ready to be afraid and then to react to that fear. Right? I imagine there's a little bit of that going on the boat when the storm comes in. They are absolutely exhausted. That's the other piece. Grief is exhausting. Right? They're absolutely exhausted, and now they are afraid, and some of them are clinging to the sides, right? Some of them are frantically trying to keep the boat aright, and at least a few of them are running around with their hands in circles or leaning over the side, right? Those are the landlubbers. And I imagine that it only gets worse when they see a ghost, right? Nothing quite as unsettling as a premonition of death when you're in the middle of a storm, right? Way to make an entrance, Jesus. Great job. Great choice, right? And to that panic, to that fear, Jesus says, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. The Greek word that Jesus uses here, take heart, it's one word, tharse, and it means to be emboldened. It means to show courage, right? That word heart comes from courage. We see it in Spanish and in Latin, right? Corazón, corar, the heart, courage. These things are they're very linked, right? And so Jesus is telling them to take heart and to show courage. And this word, tharse, to take heart, is a word that Jesus uses often throughout the Gospels. Whenever he says, do not be afraid, this is the word that he uses. Do not be afraid, but also take heart and be emboldened. Show courage. Peter is nothing if not courageous. Show courage, Jesus? Great. I'll jump out of the boat, right? I will jump out of the boat. How else do we show courage? What does it mean? Like if I told you to show courage or to take heart, how would you do that in your life? Embrace it. Embrace the fear. That's right. Yeah. Sorry? Speak up. Yeah. Take a risk. Jump off the diving board. Get back out on the field, right? Take courage. Just go and face that thing that is afraid of you. When I think of taking courage, I frequently think that it is an imperative to take a bold and decisive and independent action, right? Many of you know that I teach community organizing and leadership development at Sonoma State, and this year I have another great group of students. They're absolutely wonderful. They're eager, they're engaged, they're smart, they're tuned in to world events. And that said, I feel like I have to spend the first half of every semester at least helping them to unlearn everything that they think they know about social change. We spend the first half of the semester trying to unlearn everything that they think they know about social change, and it's not their fault. It's not their fault because everything we teach about changing the world, at least in the United States perspective, is very individualistic. It's incredibly individualistic. We teach this kind of activism that fundamentally is rooted in this idea that one person taking a stand is what makes a difference. Right? One person out there shouting loudly is what makes a difference. And it can sometimes, sure. Yeah, absolutely. But that way of working for change is very reactionary. It is often rooted in one person's desire to do the right thing, or at worst, to be seen as doing the right thing. Often that one person taking an action can be a little ineffective. It can be a little ineffective because individual action often doesn't take into account who is most impacted. Individual action often fails to expand the frame of what's possible because it fails to remember that we were not made to take action alone. French theologian Charles Péguy writes, "I cannot come to God alone because else God would ask, where are the others?" We cannot go to God alone because God would ask, where are the others? Peter jumps out of the boat. And when Peter jumps out of the boat, he seems to forget about the people who are still in the boat behind him. I've always heard this story as some sort of demonstration of Peter's courage, but I often wonder about Peter's responsibility. That is, Peter is a fisherman. He's a fisherman who owns his own boat, and many of the disciples are not. Some of the disciples are, in fact, tax collectors. Do you want to know a profession that's absolutely useless on a boat in the storm? It's going to be a white-collared profession, right? Like, put me on a boat and be like, okay, here's a storm. I don't know. I mean, can I expound on what the word for water means in Greek? Will that be helpful to us right now, right? Is the tax collector going to do math to save the day, right? Peter demonstrates this courage to jump out of the boat. But sometimes I feel like real courage is actually looking around at other people. Real courage is noticing other people's fear and saying, how could I be with you right now? How could I support you right now? What if, instead of saying, Lord, if it's you, tell me to jump out of the boat, he said, hey, Lord, people are afraid on this boat. Is there a way you can show us that it's you? Hey, Jesus, if it's you, could you calm the storm? We know in other Gospels you've done this before, right? Jesus, if it's you, can you reassure us? Can you tell me what I should say to Matthew? Because Matthew is panicking, right? Should you tell me what I should say to Luke? Could you give me some remedy because Luke is very seasick right now? Jesus, if it's you, will you demonstrate to me how to care for your people? "O ye of little faith," Jesus says, and I wonder if it's not because Peter couldn't walk on water, but because Peter got out of the boat and left his friends in the first place. "Peter, where are the others?" Jesus might have said. "Peter, where are the others?" Instead of getting out of the boat, right? What if you had cared for them? I can appreciate where Peter comes from. Often I feel like I need to take a bold and independent action because I can't just sit there, right? If you've seen me in action, you see I cannot just sit anywhere for long, right? If something needs done, I will probably do it. And when we are faced with a dichotomy of either doing nothing or taking a bold and independent action, often there is a third way. Often there is an alternative to doing nothing and doing everything ourselves. At some point, halfway through that football season, the junior high football coach had an idea. We could go for 2 points. We could go for 2 points. Instead of sending this terrified child out onto the field alone to try to kick the extra point, right? There's something called a 2-point conversion when actually the whole team can go out and work together to try to get an additional 2 points. It's just middle school football. That kid could run the ball. He could catch the ball. He could block someone else so his friend could get in the end zone. I don't know how many 2-point conversions they got, but at least that child was no longer traumatized every Thursday afternoon, right? There's a middle way between staying on the bench and going at it alone. That's the way of Christ. That's the way of being bound to others. That's the way of taking care of the people to whom Christ has entrusted us. The end of this story, what happens at the end of this story? What does Jesus do? He puts Peter back in the boat, right? He puts Peter back in the boat where he belongs. He puts Peter back in the boat with his friends and gives Peter another opportunity to maybe learn what it is to follow Jesus. He puts Peter in the boat, and what I find noticeable is that it's not Peter, but it's the people who are in the boat who testify. The people in the boat are the ones who give thanks to God, who give thanks to Jesus for restoring them as a community. Beloved, it is not unexpected if in your life grief has moved you to fear. It is not unexpected if you are just afraid in general, because quite frankly, things are very scary in our world right now. What I would commend to us, though, is a reminder that we don't have to react to fear on our own. Courage doesn't look like one of us, right, taking a step out of a boat, but perhaps all of us looking to each other, wondering where are the others and how we can care for one another better. In this way, I give thanks for the ways in which Jesus restores us to community, entrusts us to each other, commends us to take care of one another, that in this way we might all testify to God's goodness and to what God is doing among us. Thanks be to God.